folks. And like Mike said, this is the field day that we had this summer, and I wanted to start out by saying if anybody is interested in coming, because you're real interested in blueberries, you can, I think my email address is on your handouts about this stuff. You can send me an email, or if the dates don't work, really you're welcome to call me and say you want to come over and look at them whenever. So I wanted to give a little background for how this trial got started. First, so far it's been funded by 2 specialty crop block grants from the Delaware Department of Agriculture, and the first one was actually obtained by a grower whose name is Bennetts. He's in his early 20s. His family has a peach orchard in southern Sussex County, and he was interested in getting into blueberries, and he got this grant to look at establishment practices, and part of the project was to establish this trial at the research farm at Georgetown. And then we had several trials at Bennett Orchard. So I'm going to be talking about the variety trial at Georgetown, and then there's also a variety trial at Bennett Orchards. And Hale has also been very gracious in having people visit his farm to see his plantings. And so if that's something that you are interested in doing, you can contact me, and I'm sure he would be happy to have you there. So originally there were several different things that we were looking at, and I'm going to talk mostly about the variety trials. And if you are interested in some of these other things, there's some information about the mulch study and the soil amendment study in the handouts, and I might get to a few slides about that at the end. Then we got a continuation to keep looking at this, because in the beginning, we're not fruiting the blueberries for the first 2 years after planting, so we couldn't take yield data. So then the past 3 years, we have been taking yield data, which is really what we're interested in anyway. So these are the trials that we have continued, that we have taken the yield data off of. So in the variety trial, we have 25 varieties in the trial at Georgetown, and they are arranged in a replicated study with 4 replications and 3 plants per plot, so it's 12 total plants for each of those varieties. And then at Bennett Orchards, they're looking at 10 varieties, and there's 10 plants in each of those plots, but they're not random or replicated. So this is the list of varieties, and the next slide talks about this in more detail, but what we wanted to look at is some of the newer varieties that have become available, because there are a lot of blueberry breeding programs out there right now, and they're producing a lot of new varieties. Blueberries are a crop that if you plant them and get them established, those plants will be there basically indefinitely until you rip them out, as long as you take care of them. So choosing the right variety from the beginning is important, because you're making a big investment, and if you pick the wrong one, you might be stuck with it for a while unless you want to start over again. So one thing that we were interested in looking at was some of the newer northern highbush varieties. Then we wondered if some of the southern highbush varieties would grow here on Delmarva, because these are varieties that in their genetic background, there are other species, other Vestinum species that have been crossed with corymbosum, which is the highbush blueberry. So there are other native species that are related that can be crossed, and some of them have a lot more stress tolerance and heat tolerance. They grow more vigorously, and but we don't know how cold tolerant they are. So some of these southern highbush varieties, which are the ones that are highlighted in red on this slide, have not really been, nobody's really attempted to grow them this far north, except maybe at the USDA station in New Jersey. And then Legacy is a variety that's sort of an intermediate between the northern and the southern highbush. That it has some of those other species in its pedigree, but it's mostly northern highbush. So this map shows all the varieties that are in the trial and which breeding programs they came out of. So you can see that there are quite a few from the Michigan State program. There are 2 USDA programs, one in New Jersey and one in Oregon. And then these red ones down here are the southern highbush varieties. And NC State has a very active blueberry breeding program, so we got some of their newest material. And then these other varieties from Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida are all sort of older varieties. And then we have one variety that was bred in New Zealand. It's called WREC. So I mentioned that cold tolerance is one of the things that we're concerned about with the southern highbush varieties. So on this table, these are some of the varieties that are in the trial, not all of them. Over here, I have the yield for this year in pounds per plant, and then the kind of freeze damage that we have observed in the past several years. Just to show you what I'm looking for when I'm talking about freeze damage. So these are some flower buds that got frozen. And so we have a flower bud the flower's starting to emerge here. So that one's undamaged, but there should be a whole cluster of flowers there coming out, and there isn't. And then these are some others where you can see there's some flower buds coming out, and there's some buds that are damaged, like here. So back to this table. On many of the southern highbush varieties, we have seen some freeze damage to flower buds. For some of them, that damage has been very yield limiting. So Arlen, we have seen moderate freeze damage, and then this past year we had severe freeze damage, and that has really impacted the yields that we have gotten off of that plant. So this is a variety that I would say, do not plant this on Delmarva. It cannot take the cold that we get. Star is a very nice quality variety when we can get it. We've had some freeze damage in it. I don't think I would recommend planting this here, but Arlen, we've gotten pretty much no yield off of this variety. Star, some years we get some yield off of it and some years not. Jubilee is a variety that we have seen freeze damage in pretty infrequently. And even when we have seen freeze damage, doesn't really seem to impact yield because that variety just makes an enormous number of flower buds, which is another problem entirely, which I'll talk about more later. Misty, every year we've seen freeze damage on it. It too makes an enormous amount of flower buds, and this year, even though we saw a lot of freeze damage, didn't impact yield in a way that made it a lot worse than the others. And then Legacy, the sort of southern intermediate, we did see minor freeze damage one year. Lenore is a southern highbush variety where we have never seen any freeze damage. And then WREC, we did see some freeze damage the one year. The WREC is a very early variety, so its buds are coming out early, and that might be part of the reason why. But all the other northern highbush varieties we haven't ever seen freeze damage on. Now, we'll see this year when we had some warm weather and then some really cold weather what happens. Okay, so this is yield from the trial at Bennetts. So he has 10 different varieties there. On this chart, we have yields from 2013, which was the first fruiting year. So theoretically, we were trying to remove about half the flower buds that were there. And then 2014, and then the darkest bars are this past year. There was an enormous increase in yield in his planting this year. Those plants are reaching sort of their maximal potential, and they did it real fast. He has a very well managed planting. if you want to see really nicely managed blueberries, it's a good place to go. So the varieties that have looked good at Bennetts are Nelson, which is a variety I do not have in my trial, but Hale really likes this variety. Chandler, which is a variety I do have in my trial, and I have a lot of it in my trial. And so that has looked good. Blue Gold is looking good, but there are some issues with that variety, which I'll mention later when I talk about it. And Blue Haven has looked good, but he does not like this variety because it produces a lot of sprouts from the bottom, and it's real unpleasant to prune. It takes a lot of time. So that's not a variety that he is recommending based on that experience. Okay, so then this is our yield data from Georgetown. And so again, the 2013, 2014, and 2015 yields in the blue, and then the pink is the average yield from for the 3 years. Those dark lines, again, we had a fairly large increase in yield for many of the varieties in the trial this year, coming into their 3rd year of fruiting. And but you'll see that my yields are not as high as Hale's. That's because he is taking better care of his blueberries than I am. So his are really expertly managed. Mine are moderately well managed. So you'll see that maybe this is what happens. You know, perfect management versus not quite as perfect management. And I would say not quite as perfect site. My site floods a little in the winter. That wasn't real great this past year. So Legacy, that's the northern southern intermediate. It has so these are ordered here in average yield for the 3 years. So this was the highest average year for the 3 years. Legacy, Jubilee, Lenore, Rika, Misty. We're looking probably the best out of those. And so each of those has some interesting characteristics that you'd also want to take into consideration. And I think you have a handout that has all of my comments on the varieties. Now, down here at the bottom, there are a few varieties that were planted later, like Hannah's Choice, Reveille. We haven't been fruiting them for as long, and I think they're listed on your handout as we don't have enough information yet. Because we really only started taking yield data off of them this year. Arlen and Bonus are 2 varieties, so I already talked about how Arlen is a variety that's a southern high bush that gets too much freeze damage. Definitely not recommended. Bonus does not really seem to like the trial site. It established, and then we've seen a lot of dieback in it when the plants next to it are doing just fine. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with Bonus, but it might just not work here very well. Okay, so this is a terrible chart, but but I'm going to explain it a little. It's going to get better. But this is on the bottom, the date. So this is from 2014. So this is the date of harvest, and this is the percent of yield. So the purpose of this chart is to talk about when these varieties are yielding, and each of these lines represents what we harvested off of a particular variety. So first thing I'm going to point out, the earliest varieties that we have in the trial that we've been taking yield data off of are Star, Rika, and Jubilee. So Rika is that New Zealand variety. Jubilee is a southern high bush variety that has looked pretty good, but has some issues. And then Star is another southern high bush variety, the one that I said, I guess only plant if you're a gambler. Then the 2 late varieties in the trial, these are both from the Michigan State breeding program, because one focus of that breeding program is trying to get varieties that extend the season. And at the late end of it are Liberty and Aurora. If I was going to choose one of these, I would plant Aurora because it's obviously a lot later than Liberty, and in the trials we have gotten better yields off of Aurora. So that's the late end of the season. like I mentioned that we haven't been looking at the older varieties, so there are older varieties of blueberries too. Elliott is the standard late variety, and it grows here, but it's not in the trial. Yes?
We have one that yielded 2 days.
Yes.
Why?
Well, some of them are more concentrated than others, which is, I think, the next slide.
Bonus.
Okay, so these are the varieties that had concentrated yield. So these are varieties that had more than a quarter of their yield picked on one day. So some varieties have been selected to ripen all at one time because there are blueberries that are harvested mechanically. And so there are varieties that have been developed with mechanical harvest in mind, and so you would want them all to be ripening at the same time. So these are the varieties that we had more than a quarter or more of the harvest all happening on the same date. And these are the 3 that actually had good yields out of that group. So Legacy, concentrated ripening, good yields. Blue Gold we've had good yields off of, and concentrated ripening, and Rika. Now, the other end of the spectrum here is ones that we picked over a long period of time. Strangely, Rika also ends up on this list. So these are ones that we picked on 12 or more days. We generally are picking twice a week, and so this would be representing, 6 weeks of picking for some of these. Rika, Jubilee, Misty, and Chandler. Okay, when we have our open house, the past 2 years we've tried to do it in July, and so that we have berries for people to taste test, because people come, they want to know what they want to plant, they want to taste them. So this was some of our 2014 taste testing, and these were the 3 that were most often chosen as the favorite. And Rika was most often chosen as the least favorite. That variety, it's early, it yields well, but it's very sour. And some people like that, and some people don't really like that. And then this is from this past year's taste testing. So these pink ones up here are the ones that and this is our rating scale. Delicious, good, okay, or yuck. So these pink ones up here are the ones that had more than half of the people said they were delicious or good. Jubilee, Bonus, which don't plant that one. Toro, Blue Gold, Chandler appearing again. Legacy, Misty, and Lenore showing up again. Darrow was down here at the bottom with not so many people thinking it was delicious or good. And I also wanted to mention a caveat, like I would be hesitant to plant a variety that, a lot of people, like more than a quarter of them said it was yuck. But but people, I have done or tried to do taste evaluations for blueberries and sweet corn, and it's always interesting because people have different preferences, and there are some people who are not very discerning, and if it's a blueberry and it's blue, it's delicious.
Did you also evaluate it based on eating fresh compared to cooking, how it held up for cooking?
I have not done any cooking trials on them, but yeah. Some people like blueberries that are sour, and some people don't, and some like blueberries that, to me, taste like nothing. So it's always interesting, and that's part of the reason why we have this, do this taste testing, so that at least the people who are planting the blueberries can taste them, I guess, decide what they want. But there are differences, is I guess also the take home. And there are differences in how they look. These are not pictures of all the varieties in the trial, and there are more, and you have in the handout, but I don't have in the slideshow, there are big differences in size. So Chandler makes an absolutely enormous berry, and it yields well. So it would be, if I was going to plant blueberries for a U-pick operation, would be one that I would consider, because people would be able to pick a lot of them fast. They pick really fast. This is the variety that we have that we're using for our mulch studies and our soil amendment studies. So it's good in that regard, but somebody who, if you have customers who want to make blueberry muffins, that I wouldn't recommend Chandler. You'll have a giant blob of blue goo in there, because they're like, the largest ones are the size of a quarter. Toro is another, the large sized berries, just slightly smaller than Chandler. Aurora, this is the late variety that I would recommend, but you can see that it has sort of flattened berries and has a lot of bloom on them, so they look kind of whitish. It doesn't necessarily look conventional. WREC is really dark. It tends to be small. Legacy is sort of a normal blueberry-looking blueberry, and Blue Crop, of course, this is the standard in our trial, and this is probably the most widely planted blueberry variety out there. So this is what people are used to seeing. And I've got some pictures of the plants. So of the ones that you might want to try, Lenore. This is the southern highbush variety that we have not seen any freeze damage on. We've gotten good yields off of it, and it has gotten good taste ratings. Legacy is that northern southern highbush intermediate. We've gotten decent yields off of it. It has gotten good taste ratings. Chandler, I just talked a lot about Chandler. Giant berries. You can see it has a very different plant habit. It's much more woody, and you don't get as many shoots coming up from the bottom. That means you have to prune differently. Blue Crop, it works fine. This is what people expect to eat when they eat a blueberry. It's also pretty easy to prune. If you read the recommendations on how to prune a blueberry, and then you look at a Blue Crop plant, then those recommendations make sense. Some of these other things, like that one, it doesn't make sense. Jubilee, this is the southern highbush variety. We've seen some freeze damage on it. It has pretty good taste ratings most years. The issue with Jubilee is this is the smallest fruited variety that we have in the trial, and that is partly probably because it flowers profusely, and I tried to prune it really hard and remove a lot of flowers this past year. I managed to increase the berry size somewhat, but it was still small. So it's an interesting variety. It grows like crazy. It's very vigorous. But as far as like for commercial, it would be real unfun to pick. Then Nelson, this is the one that Hale likes. All right. This is the mulch material study, and the big take home from the mulch material study is make sure that you don't mulch with things that raise your soil pH, because blueberries prefer or will only grow in a soil pH of 4.5 to 5. So that's where you need to keep it. And we tried some different mulch materials in our study, and these are the soil pHs in the blue out of the plots. So when we looked at it in 2012 and 13, the one mulch material that we used, which was sawdust horse bedding with, that had been composted, we were starting to get that pH moving out of the range where we wanted, whereas our other mulch materials were staying low. Then looking again in this past spring, we had 2 treatments, this horse bedding and then the chipped construction waste that were taking our soil pH too high. And when we looked at the pH of the actual materials that we were using, we could have guessed that probably those were going to be a problem. So if you're growing blueberries and you're using something unconventional as mulch, which you could, you might want to get a pH on the material that you're using. And then this is a picture showing the different abilities to control weeds in. So pine bark, corn stalks, pretty good weed control. Waste hay, okay. The horse bedding was a disaster. Then this was a planting hole amendment study. And what we were looking at here is the recommended practice is to add a gallon of peat moss into the planting hole at planting, mixed with the backfill soil. So we were looking at that recommended treatment versus some other things that we could maybe use instead. So we were looking at this chipped construction waste that we'd screen to get only the fine stuff, that horse bedding, pine bark fines, and then waste silage, and then our other control was no amendment. So silage is naturally acidic, pine bark fines naturally acidic. These two things from the mulch study we know are not naturally acidic, but we were adding sulfur to them as we mix them into the planting hole. And so these are our yields. And we did see some yield differences between these two treatments. The standard peat moss is the best thing to do, but it's expensive. So if you want to try something else, it might be better than nothing, but it's really hard to predict probably the effect that you're going to get. But definitely there's a benefit of adding peat moss to the planting hole. Oh, I don't know. Let's see. If I remember correctly, we screened it through like hardware cloth, like I don't know, it was probably a centimeter square.
So they're getting that pretty small.
Yeah, yes. And that was pretty well composted, so there was a lot of material and there was more like soil. Yes, sir.
Have you looked at plant placement in terms of yields as far as spacing, rows, columns, et cetera, what you would recommend?
That's not something that we have looked at experimentally. And you should make those decisions based on, generally in the row you want 5 feet, and then your row spacing, you want to think about what you might want to be driving in between your plants, how you want to be irrigating, and if you want to put netting over them for birds.
Would 10 be healthy?
10 is fine, but don't plan on driving anything too big between them once the bushes are full size. Yes.
What's in the construction waste?
Oh, so the construction waste was an old poultry house that had been torn down, and then the wood waste from that deconstruction was ground up in a chipper, and that it sat in a pile for a while.
Was it chicken manure in it?
No, it was just the structure.
What's the pH of peat moss?
The pH of peat moss, I don't know, but it should be low. Like, it should be in that 4.5 range.
Any other questions for Emily?
All right. Have you done the cross with size, taste, appearance, color, the perfect berry?
Well, so the perfect berry depends on what you want to do. Of my tasters?
Yes.
So I think Lenore, if I was going to recommend something for people to try in this area, I would say try Chandler and try Lenore and then maybe Legacy. And
The perfect berry palette you would choose.
for me, as far as taste, I like Lenore. I like sweet and sour together with
The balance.
the balance. I don't like flat berries.
When do you prune?
March.
So even though those showed buds on, those buds that you had were after March? They're not already set?
No, they are already set, so you can tell the flower buds. You can distinguish between the flower buds and leaf buds when you're pruning. So you're actually trying to remove some flower buds usually when you're pruning. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Amy.
Thank you.